The sound tore through the classroom before anyone could brace for it. A deep, rolling growl shook the speakers mounted on the ceiling, followed by a shriek so sharp that 3 students dropped their datapads at once. My own 4 hands clamped over the sides of my head. Across the room, Mira folded her wings tight against her back and pressed herself into the corner of her seat. Even Corin, who never showed fear in front of anyone, had gone still as stone, his eye stalks frozen mid-turn toward the speaker. Professor Yara Voss stood at the front of the room with her arms crossed, watching us the way a predator watches something that has just noticed it is being hunted. She let the sound play a second time. The growl came again, low and endless, like something enormous breathing out through gritted teeth. "This," she said, once the sound faded, "is the call of one of the deadliest creatures recorded across 17 surveyed star systems. Xenobiologists who study it from orbit refuse to land within 2 kilometers of a confirmed nest." Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. I glanced sideways, past Dax Marrow's rigid shoulders, toward the one student in the room who had not flinched even slightly. Cale Brennan sat with his chin resting on one hand, elbow propped on the desk, looking at the speaker with the mild curiosity of someone listening to weather on the radio. He was the only human most of us had ever seen up close, and in the 3 weeks since he had arrived at the academy, he had done almost nothing to explain why his species had a warship class named after extinct predators, or why every other government in the quadrant treated humanity with the same caution you might give an unexploded device. Professor Voss noticed his lack of reaction too. Of course she did. I think she had been waiting for it. "Cadet Brennan," she said, her tone sharpening into something almost triumphant. "You don't seem troubled." Cale straightened up a little, blinking as if he had only just realized the whole room was staring at him. "Sorry, was I supposed to be?" A ripple of nervous laughter went through part of the class, quickly silenced by Professor Voss's glare. She tapped her datapad, and the recording began playing again, louder this time, filling the room with that same bone-deep growl. "This animal," she continued, raising her voice over the noise, "has killed survey teams. Armored survey teams. It hunts in silence, and only vocalizes like this, to warn off rivals its own size. There is nothing in the galaxy that considers this creature harmless."
Cale tilted his head, listening properly now, and then he did something none of us expected.
He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the tight, polite smile he sometimes gave when he didn't understand one of our customs. A real smile, easy and warm, like he had just heard an old song from home. "That's just a pet," he said. The room went dead silent. I actually looked around to see if I had misheard. My translator implant sometimes struggled with human vocal patterns, but 3 of my classmates wore the exact same stunned expression, so I knew I had heard him correctly. Professor Voss's mouth opened slightly before she caught herself and closed it again. "I'm sorry," she said, very slowly. "The way you speak to someone you think might be having a medical episode. Could you repeat that?" "That sound," Cale said, pointing casually at the ceiling speaker. "It's just a pet. We've got one at home, actually. Well, my family does. Big lazy thing. Sleeps about 16 hours a day." Dax Marrow let out a short, disbelieving laugh from 2 rows back. "A pet," he repeated, his mandibles clicking together, in what I recognized as pure disdain. "You are telling us that this," he gestured wildly at the speaker, "this recorded warning cry from an apex predator, so dangerous that 3 border colonies evacuated after one was spotted nearby, is something you keep in your house?" "Pretty much, yeah." Cale shrugged, like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world. "Though ours doesn't really warn anybody off, she just wants attention. Gets loud when she's hungry, or when she wants someone to open a door for her." Professor Voss set down her datapad with a controlled, careful motion that told me she was working very hard not to raise her voice. "Cadet Brennan, I want to be clear about what you are claiming. This recording," she said, tapping the speaker control again so the growl rolled through the room a 3rd time, "was captured by a long-range sensor array on a survey vessel that lost 2 crew members investigating the source. You are telling this class that your species keeps this animal as a domestic companion. I mean, not this exact species, obviously," Cale said, and for the first time there was a flicker of genuine thought behind his easy expression, like he was actually trying to place the sound. "But that's basically the same call pattern as one of our big cats. The pitch, the rhythm, Even that little rasp at the end. If I had to guess, I'd say your recording device probably just amplified the audio a lot, made it sound bigger and scarier than it actually was up close. Distance does weird things to sound. The class erupted. Not into panic this time, but into overlapping voices, all talking over each other, all directed at Kale. I heard Talus, 3 seats over, insisting this had to be some kind of misunderstanding, caused by faulty translation software. I heard Corin muttering that humans clearly had some strange evolutionary quirk that made them incapable of recognizing danger. I heard Mira, quieter than the rest, asking nobody in particular whether this meant human homes were full of creatures like the one on the recording. Professor Voss raised a hand, and the room slowly settled, though the tension did not fade at all. If anything, it had gotten worse, thicker, the kind of silence that comes right before someone says something nobody can take back. Cadet Brennan, she said, I have taught this course for 11 years. I have shown this recording to 11 separate incoming classes. Every single time, without exception, every student in the room has reacted with fear. That is the correct reaction. That is the reaction any sane, self-preserving organism should have when confronted with the call of an apex predator. She paused, letting her words settle. You did not react, and now you are telling me that not only were you unafraid, but you recognized the sound as something your species keeps as a household pet. Do you understand how that sounds to the rest of this class? Kale actually looked a little sheepish then, rubbing the back of his neck the way I had noticed humans did when they felt they had said something socially clumsy. Yeah, I guess I can see how that's a lot to take in, he admitted. Sorry, I didn't mean to freak everyone out. I just wasn't expecting the sound to be treated as like a big scary mystery. It's a pretty common noise where I'm from. Common, Dax repeated, his voice climbing half an octave. You call the death cry of an apex predator common? It's not really a death cry, Kale said, and now he sounded like he was trying to be helpful, which somehow made it worse. It's more of an announcement noise. They do it when they're excited, or annoyed, or when they see another one of their kind, and want it to know they're around. Honestly, the scariest thing about ours is when she decides 3 in the morning is a good time to demand breakfast. I found myself staring at him the way you stare at something that does not fit into any category you already understand. Since Kale had arrived at the academy, I had heard dozens of small, strange comments from him. He had once mentioned, without any particular emphasis, that his homeworld had an entire ocean full of animals that could crush a shuttle pod without much effort, and that most beaches simply posted a sign about it rather than banning swimming outright. He had shrugged off a training exercise in triple standard gravity that left 2 other cadets needing medical attention, saying it felt about right. He had eaten a spice sample in the dining hall that made half the room's ventilation system trigger an alert, and he had asked, genuinely confused, why everyone was so alarmed. At the time, I had assumed these were exaggerations, the kind of stories new students tell to seem interesting. But sitting there, watching him talk about an apex predator like it was a mildly demanding house cat, a different thought started to take shape in my mind, one I did not like at all. What if he wasn't exaggerating? Professor Voss seemed to be wrestling with the same thought. She studied Kale for a long moment, her earlier confidence replaced by something more careful, more searching. Cadet Brennan, she said finally, I want you to understand that this is a serious claim. If you are correct, it changes everything this class, and frankly this institution, understands about your species' baseline tolerance for danger. If you are mistaken, or if this is some kind of joke at our expense, I need you to say so now. It's not a joke, Kale said, and for the first time, his tone lost its casual edge entirely. He looked around the room, taking in all of our faces, the fear that still lingered in some of them, the disbelief in others. I promise you, I'm not trying to mess with anyone. I just genuinely didn't realize this would be such a big deal. Where I'm from, this sound means someone's cat wants dinner. That's it. That's the whole story. The word cat meant nothing to any of us, but the confidence in his voice did. It was not the confidence of someone telling a tall tale. It was the flat, unbothered confidence of someone stating a fact so obvious to him that he hadn't even considered anyone might doubt it. Dax leaned forward, his mandibles clicking rapidly, a sign of building aggression among his kind, though I had learned enough about him to know it was mostly bluster. Then prove it, he said, If this is truly some harmless creature you keep for companionship, show us. Call your home. Let us see this pet with our own eyes." A murmur ran through the class, equal parts excitement and dread. Professor Voss's eyes narrowed, but she did not object. If anything, she looked like she wanted to see this proven wrong just as badly as Dax did. Cale considered it for a moment, glancing at the wall chronometer, doing what looked like a quick calculation in his head. "It'd be evening back home," he said slowly. "My family should be around. Yeah, all right, let's do it." He said it so simply, so without hesitation, that it silenced the last of the murmuring in the room. There was no bravado in his voice, no nervous energy, nothing that suggested a person bluffing his way out of a corner. He said it the way you might agree to show someone a photo on your datapad. Professor Voss straightened, some of her composure returning now that there was a clear plan of action. "Very well," she said. "We will connect after the recess period. I want every student in this room present for it." Her gaze swept across us, lingering just slightly longer on me than the others, though I couldn't say why. Whatever the outcome, I suspect today's lesson is not going to end the way any of us expected. The bell chime sounded, marking the end of the period, but nobody moved right away. For a long moment, the entire class simply sat there, looking at Cale, who was already gathering his things, with the same relaxed ease he brought to everything else, as if he hadn't just upended everything we thought we understood about danger, about fear, and about the quiet, unassuming human, sitting 3 seats to my left. I stayed in my seat a little longer than everyone else, replaying the sound in my head, that low growl that had made my hands fly to my head without thinking. I tried to imagine it coming from something small enough to live in a house, something gentle enough to be called a pet, something that simply wanted its dinner. I could not make the two ideas fit together, not yet. But something told me that by the end of the recess period, I was going to have to. The hallway outside the classroom buzzed with a nervous kind of energy I had never experienced during a break period before. Normally, students scattered toward the dining hall or the courtyard the moment class ended, eager to escape another hour of lectures. Today, almost nobody left. Small groups clustered near the classroom doors, whispering, some of them glancing toward Cale every few seconds, like he might do something unexpected if they looked away for too long. I found myself standing near Mira, who kept flexing her wings in short, anxious movements, a habit she only showed when she was working through something that unsettled her. "Do you believe him?" she asked quietly, not looking at me, her eyes fixed on Cale's back as he walked with easy strides toward the comms room, where the recess call would take place. I thought about the question longer than I meant to. "I don't know," I admitted. "He doesn't sound like he's lying. But nothing about what he's saying makes sense either."
"Maybe that's the point.
she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like dread.
Maybe it isn't supposed to make sense to us."
I didn't have an answer for that. I only knew that the low growl from the recording was still echoing somewhere in the back of my mind, and that in a few minutes, we were all about to find out exactly what kind of creature could make a sound like that, and still be called, by the boy who grinned through the whole thing, nothing more than a pet. The comms room was smaller than our classroom, built for maintenance briefings rather than an audience of 20 anxious students, so we crowded in shoulder to shoulder, wingtip to carapace, everyone straining to see the projection screen at the front. Professor Voss stood near the control panel, arms folded, her earlier confidence replaced by a tight, watchful stillness. Dax had pushed his way to the front row, arms crossed, clearly expecting to be proven right at any moment. I ended up wedged between Mira and Corin, close enough to feel Mira's wings still trembling faintly against my shoulder. Cale sat at the console like this was any other day, tapping through a contact list on the projected screen with the same unhurried calm he'd shown since the recording first played. "Signal should reach home in a few seconds," he said, mostly to himself. "Time difference means it should be around dinner. Hopefully nobody's in the middle of anything." "You say that as though this is a casual visit," Professor Voss said, her voice clipped. "You understand what is at stake here." "I mean, yeah, but it's also just a call home," Cale said, glancing up at her with a look that was somewhere between amused and genuinely puzzled. "I talk to my family every week. This isn't really different." The screen flickered, static rolling across it in uneven waves, and for a moment, I thought the connection would fail entirely, sparing us whatever waited on the other end. Then, the static cleared, and a room appeared, humbler than I expected, filled with warm yellow light and soft furniture in shades of green and brown. A woman with dark hair and Kale's same easy smile leaned into frame, wiping her hands on a cloth like she had just come from preparing food. "Kale," she said, her voice bright with surprise. "You're early. Everything all right?" "Hey, Mom," Kale said, grinning. "Yeah, everything's fine. I've got a favor to ask, actually. My whole class is here, and there's kind of a whole thing happening. Is she around?" His mother, whose name I would later learn was Grace, glanced over her shoulder, a faint line of confusion crossing her face. "Who? The cat?" "She's around here somewhere. Probably parked on the couch like always. Why? What's going on?" "Long story," Kale said. "Short version, my class heard a recording of what they think is one of the deadliest predators in the galaxy, and it sounded exactly like her when she wants dinner. Nobody believes me that she's just a big lazy house cat." Grace laughed, a warm, easy sound that seemed to fill the small room she stood in. "Oh, that'll do it," she said. "Hold on, let me see if I can get her over here. Noah, can you grab her? Bring her by the screen." A younger voice called back from somewhere out of frame, and a moment later a boy who couldn't have been older than 11 or 12, Kale's brother by the resemblance, came into view, arms wrapped loosely around something large and reddish gold that shifted lazily against him, clearly unbothered by being carried. The room behind me went utterly silent. I felt every hair on my scalp fold flat, an instinctive reflex among my species when confronted with sudden alarm. Beside me, Mira's wings snapped rigid, no longer trembling but frozen in place. Even Dax, who had spent the entire recess period certain Kale was either lying or mistaken, took a full step backward, colliding with the student behind him. Because the creature draped across Noah's arms, its head resting against his shoulder with what could only be described as complete contentment, was unmistakably the source of the recording. The same broad, powerful jaw, the same deep-set eyes, half closed in something like boredom, the same thick, muscular frame that our own recordings had described as capable of ending an armored survey team without much effort. And it was purring. That was the only word my translator could offer for the low, rhythmic rumble that came from its chest, a sound gentler and far less alarming than the recorded growl, but unmistakably related, like a quieter cousin of the same voice. "There she is," Kale said warmly, angling the screen so we could all see. "This is Ruby. Say hi, Ruby." As if on cue, the creature lifted its head, blinked slowly at the screen, and let out the exact same growling call we had heard in the classroom, only softer, closer, and, impossibly, almost affectionate. Noah laughed and scratched behind one of its rounded ears, and the creature leaned into his hand, eyes closing again in obvious pleasure. Nobody in the comms room made a sound for what felt like a very long time. Professor Voss was the first to find her voice, though it came out thinner than her usual commanding tone. "That is the creature from the recording," she said slowly, as though saying it aloud might make it easier to believe. "That is the exact vocal signature." "Pretty much. Yeah," Kale said, glancing back at the professor with an expression that suggested he still didn't fully understand why this was such a revelation. "I mean, it's not the exact same species as whatever your recording caught. Different world, different biology probably, but it's close enough that the sound tracks almost perfectly. Cats do this thing where the bigger and angrier they sound, the smaller and lazier they usually are in real life. Ruby's basically just a very large, very demanding house cat who happens to have a scary voice." "Demanding," Grace repeated from the screen, laughing again as she reached over to rub the creature's head. "That's one word for it. She'll walk right over your face at 4 in the morning if her food bowl's empty." "Absolutely no shame about it either." Noah grinned, hefting the creature a little higher on his hip, though from the size of it, I suspected it weighed nearly as much as he did. "She likes belly rubs," he offered helpfully, as if this detail might somehow help us understand. "But only for like 10 seconds, then she bites. Not hard though," Grace added quickly, seeing several of us flinch at the word bites. "It's more of a warning nip. She's not actually trying to hurt anyone. It's just how she plays." I realized, somewhere in the back of my mind, that this entire conversation was happening as though it were the most unremarkable thing in the world. A boy carrying an apex predator like a bundle of laundry. A mother casually mentioning being walked over by said predator in the middle of the night. A brief offhand comment about biting that was meant to be reassuring rather than alarming. Dax found his voice before I did, though it came out smaller than his usual bravado.
How?
He started, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. How is that creature not attacking either of you right now? Every survey report on that vocal signature describes an animal capable of overpowering armored personnel. Cale tilted his head, considering the question seriously for the first time since the recording had first played. I think maybe that's kind of the point, he said slowly. Your survey teams probably ran into something like Ruby's wild ancestors, out in an environment where they've never learned that humans aren't a threat, and where they've had to hunt to survive their whole lives. Ruby's never had to hunt for anything harder than a bowl of food that's already sitting right there for her. She's basically never known danger. That probably changes a lot about how an animal acts, even if the growl sounds the same. Professor Voss stepped closer to the screen, studying the creature with the intense, careful focus of someone reevaluating everything they thought they understood. You are suggesting, she said slowly, that the difference between a creature capable of ending an armored team and a creature that sleeps 16 hours a day on a couch is not biology, but environment. I mean, some of it's definitely still biology, Cale said. Ruby's still got the teeth and the claws to do some damage if she really wanted to. She's just never had a reason to use them for anything more serious than knocking a cup off the table because she wanted attention. Humans have basically bred that instinct way, way down over a long, long time. It's not that the danger's completely gone. It's just buried under a whole lot of comfort and a very reliable food bowl. The room stayed quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, less like fear and more like the slow, uneasy process of a room full of minds, recalculating everything they thought they knew. I found myself staring at the screen, at Ruby's half-closed eyes, and the low rumble still rolling from her chest, and thinking about the 2 survey crew members our lesson had mentioned, the ones lost investigating a version of this exact sound. If Ruby's wild ancestors could do that, and Ruby herself was simply the version of that creature that had never needed to be dangerous, what did that say about the animals humans had never bothered to tame at all? What did it say about the animals that still lived wild on their homeworld, the ones nobody had spent generations breeding into something safe enough to sleep on a couch? I glanced sideways at Mira, whose wings had finally stopped trembling, though her expression had settled into something far more unsettled than fear. It was the look of someone doing math they didn't want to finish. Cadet Brennan, Professor Voss said finally, her voice carefully measured. The tone of someone trying very hard to sound like this hadn't shaken her entire understanding of her own class. I think we owe you an apology. It seems your claim was accurate. No hard feelings, Cale said easily, waving a hand. Honestly, I probably should have explained it better before showing you. I forget sometimes that not everybody grew up around this stuff. Grace, still visible on the screen behind him, gave a small, curious tilt of her head. Cale, honey, what exactly did you tell them the recording was? They thought it was one of the deadliest predators in surveyed space, Cale said, grinning. There was a brief pause on the other end of the call, and then Grace laughed so hard she had to lean against the doorway for support, while Noah, still holding Ruby, looked between the screen and his brother with obvious delight, clearly enjoying the reaction far more than he understood the reason for it. Oh, that's wonderful, Grace managed between laughs. Wait until I tell your father. He's going to want to hear all about the deadliest predator in the galaxy, demanding her dinner at 6 o'clock sharp, every single evening. The laughter from the other end of the call, warm and unguarded, felt strange against the tense silence that still lingered in our own room. It was the sound of people who had never once considered that the creature curled contentedly in their home might be viewed, by anyone, anywhere, as something to fear. And that, more than the growl, more than the size of the creature, more than anything Cale had said, was the detail that stayed with me long after the call ended. Not that humans kept dangerous animals as pets, but that they didn't consider them dangerous at all. The call had barely ended before Dax pushed forward again, refusing to let the matter rest. Wait, he said, holding up a hand toward the now dark screen. That cannot be the whole story. One tame animal does not explain a species that builds warships named after extinction events. There has to be more to this than a docile house pet. Cale leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. And for the first time since the lesson began, I saw something shift behind his expression, a flicker of consideration, like he was deciding how much he actually wanted to explain. "Okay, fair point," he said. "Ruby's tame because generations of people decided to breed the danger out of her ancestors. Right up until what's left is basically a very affectionate, very demanding roommate. But that's not really how most of Earth works. That's just the part of it people bring inside their houses." "Meaning what exactly?" Professor Voss asked, arms still crossed, though her posture had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Meaning outside the house. Things are a lot less tame," Kale said. "There's a reason we don't let Ruby's wild cousins wander around cities. Some of them are a lot bigger than her, a lot faster, and they've never had a reason to trust anybody. We just don't usually think about them the same way, because most people don't run into them very often." Mira's wings twitched beside me. "You are saying there are creatures on your world more dangerous than the one in the recording," she said slowly, "and that this is simply considered normal." "I mean, sort of, yeah," Kale said, and there was no bravado in his voice at all, just the same easy honesty he'd carried the entire lesson. "We've got animals that could probably do a lot worse than what your survey report described. Big ones in the ocean that could take out a boat without much trouble. Ones on land that hunt in packs and could bring down something a lot bigger than a person. We just built fences and signs and rules about where people are allowed to go, and most of the time that's enough." "Most of the time," Corin repeated, his eye stalks swiveling toward Kale with obvious unease. "That phrasing does not inspire confidence." Kale actually laughed at that, a short, genuine sound. "Yeah, I guess it doesn't sound great when you put it that way. But honestly, most people go their whole lives without ever running into anything dangerous. It's mostly just background noise, something you know is out there, but don't really think about day to day." I found myself trying to picture it, an entire world where deadly creatures existed not as rare, terrifying anomalies but as an accepted, almost mundane fact of daily life, the way we might think about weather or traffic. The idea unsettled me more than the recording had. "How do you live like that?" Mira asked quietly, and I could hear the genuine confusion in her voice. Not judgment, just an honest attempt to understand something that made no sense within her own frame of reference. "Knowing that danger exists so close to where you live, and simply choosing not to think about it." Kale considered the question seriously, and for a moment, the easy grin faded into something more thoughtful. "I think it's less about not thinking about it, and more about just deciding it's not worth being scared of something you can't control," he said. "Fear that doesn't help you survive is just extra weight. You learn the rules, you respect the danger, and then you go on with your day. Worrying about a shark while you're sitting in a classroom on the other side of the planet doesn't actually make you any safer. It just makes the classroom worse." Professor Voss had gone very quiet, watching Kale with an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between professional fascination and something closer to concern. "That is a remarkably calm philosophy for a species that apparently shares its world with predators capable of ending survey teams," she said finally. "Maybe," Kale said with a shrug. "Or maybe it's just what happens when you've had a really, really long time to get used to it. Danger's kind of just part of the background where I'm from. Storms, animals, other people even. You don't get rid of the fear completely, but you figure out pretty fast that panicking about every single thing that could go wrong isn't actually a good survival strategy. It just makes you slower to react to the stuff that actually matters." The room had gone very still again, but it was a different kind of stillness than before. Nobody in the class was afraid of Kale, not exactly, but there was a new, careful distance in the way everyone looked at him, as though the easy, friendly cadet they had known for 3 weeks had suddenly revealed a second, much larger shape standing behind him, one none of us had noticed until now. Dax, to his credit, seemed to be the only one still trying to push past his own discomfort toward something resembling curiosity. "You keep speaking as though danger is simply a constant you have learned to ignore," he said. "But there must be limits. Things even your species finds genuinely alarming." Kale thought about that for a long moment, longer than he had thought about any of the other questions. "Sure, there's plenty that scares us," he said eventually. "I don't want to make it sound like we're just walking around fearless all the time, because that's not true either. People get scared. People die from all kinds of things, animals included. It's just that we've had thousands of years to build up a pretty thick callus around it. Doesn't mean the nerve underneath isn't still there. A callus, I repeated, testing the word, the first time I had spoken since the recording first played. Kale glanced toward me, apparently a little surprised that I'd chosen this moment to join the conversation. Yeah, he said, like when your hands get tough from doing the same hard work over and over. The work doesn't get easier. You just stop feeling it the same way. I think that's kind of what happened with us, and danger in general. We didn't get less breakable. We just got a lot more used to being around things that could break us, and stopped letting that stop us from living our lives. Professor Voss exchanged a brief glance with the two other faculty members who had quietly slipped into the back of the comms room sometime during the call, drawn, I assumed, by whatever alert had gone out once the lesson took an unexpected turn. Neither of them said anything, but their expressions carried the same unsettled weight I could feel building in my own chest. I want to return to something you said earlier, Professor Voss said, choosing her words with obvious care. You mentioned rules, fences, signs, a structure your species built specifically to manage a level of danger you consider, in your own words, background noise. I would like to understand what that structure looks like on a larger scale, beyond a single household pet. Kale exhaled slowly, glancing around the room at all of us, and for the first time I saw something like hesitation cross his face, not fear exactly, but the careful weighing of someone deciding how much truth a room could hold at once. That's kind of a bigger conversation, he said finally. Bigger than one class period, probably. We have time, Professor Voss said, and her voice left no room for argument. I believe, given everything we have seen today, that this class deserves a fuller understanding of what we are dealing with. Kale glanced toward the darkened screen where the call had ended, as though picturing Ruby still curled on the couch back home, entirely unaware that her sleepy, demanding presence had just cracked open a much larger and far less comfortable conversation. All right, he said finally, straightening in his seat, but you're the ones who asked. There was no bravado in the way he said it, no warning, no threat, nothing that resembled the posturing I might have expected from someone about to reveal something dangerous about their species. It was, if anything, almost apologetic, the tone of someone who genuinely wished the conversation didn't have to go where it was about to go, but understood there was no polite way to avoid it any longer. I sat forward in my seat, along with the rest of the class, every one of us waiting, unsure whether we actually wanted the answer we had all just demanded. Where I'm from, Kale began, there used to be a lot more things that could kill you without warning, not just animals. Sickness, weather, other people, back when resources were scarce, and nobody had figured out how to share them properly. For most of our history, staying alive was basically a full-time job. He paused, choosing his next words carefully, the way someone picks their footing crossing unstable ground. So we built things, walls at first, then villages, then cities, then whole systems designed to keep the worst of it as far away from daily life as possible. Every generation added another layer, medicine to fight the sickness, laws to handle the people, fences and studies, and warning systems for the animals. It took thousands of years, but eventually most of us reached a point where we could go about our whole lives without ever directly facing the kind of danger our ancestors dealt with constantly. That sounds like progress, Professor Voss said carefully. Every species works to reduce risk to its population. I fail to see how that explains the reaction this class had to a single recorded sound. Because the danger didn't actually go away, Kale said. We just got really good at building walls around it. And here's the thing about walls. Once you've spent your whole life on the safe side of one, you kind of forget what's on the other side. You stop being afraid, not because the thing you should be afraid of disappeared, but because you've never actually had to stand in front of it without something between you and it. I felt a small, cold weight settle in my chest, though I couldn't yet explain why. You are saying the fear didn't disappear, I said slowly. It just moved somewhere else. Kale looked at me, and something in his expression told me I had landed closer to the truth than he was entirely comfortable with. Yeah, he said, pretty much. It moved into how we prepare for things, how we plan, how careful we are about the things that could still go wrong, even after all the walls. We didn't get less afraid of danger. We just got a lot better at not letting that fear show while we deal with it. Dax leaned forward, his earlier hostility replaced now with something closer to genuine unease. You are describing a species that has spent its entire history systematically neutralizing every threat to its own survival, he said slowly. Down to and including other members of your own species, if I understood you correctly. When we had to, yeah, Kale said, and there was no pride in his voice when he said it, only a kind of tired honesty. It's not something we're proud of, most of it. A lot of our history is pretty rough, but it's also why we're still here, and why most of us don't spend our days worrying about the things that used to be normal for our ancestors. We built a world where the scariest sound most people hear on an average day is an alarm clock, not a predator outside the door. The room had gone very quiet again, but the silence had a different texture now, heavier, more considering. I found myself thinking about the recording, the growl that had made every hand in the room fly to a head or a chest in pure reflex, and I thought about Ruby, curled contentedly on a couch on the other side of a call, utterly unaware that she had ever been anything to fear. And I thought about what Kale had said, that the fear hadn't gone away, that it had simply moved. If your species has spent so long neutralizing every threat it encounters, Professor Voss said slowly, each word measured with obvious care, what does that mean for a threat your species has never encountered before? One, it cannot yet neutralize? Kale was quiet for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had none of its earlier warmth. It was flat, careful, the voice of someone choosing to be honest rather than comfortable. I think it means we treat it the same way we treated everything else, he said, carefully, patiently, for as long as it takes. We're not a species that panics well, but we're a species that plans really, really well. That's kind of the whole point of everything I just told you. We didn't survive by being the strongest thing out there. We survived by being the ones who were still standing, after everything stronger than us either got tamed, got fenced in, or got studied until it wasn't a mystery anymore.
Nobody in the room spoke.
I glanced around at my classmates, at Mira's still trembling wings, at Corin's frozen eye stalks, at Dax, who for the first time since the lesson began, looked less like someone eager for an argument and more like someone quietly recalculating everything he thought he understood about the boy sitting 3 seats away from him. Professor Voss was the one who finally broke the silence, though her voice had lost the sharp, commanding edge it carried at the start of the lesson. "Cadet Brennan," she said slowly, "I confess I began this exercise intending to demonstrate the dangers of the wider galaxy to a room of first-year students. I did not anticipate that the lesson would end with a demonstration of something far more unsettling. Sorry about that," Kale said, and he did look genuinely apologetic, his easy grin from earlier entirely gone now. I really didn't mean to turn a class period into, well, whatever this turned into. I just wanted everyone to stop being scared of my cat. A short, surprised laugh escaped Mira before she could stop it, breaking some of the tension that had built in the room, though it did little to erase the deeper unease that had settled beneath it. Even Professor Voss allowed herself a brief, tired smile. "I believe you have succeeded in that goal," she said, "though I suspect the lesson you have taught this class extends considerably further than household pets." Kale gave a small, rueful nod, glancing once more toward the dark screen where the call had ended, where somewhere far away Ruby was likely still curled contentedly on a couch, utterly unaware of the conversation her sleepy purring had set into motion. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, addressing the whole room now rather than just the professor, "none of what I said means you all need to be scared of us. We're not looking for trouble. Most of us just want to learn, same as anybody else here. I just think it's important you understand what you're actually looking at, instead of just seeing a species that seems calm and assuming that means harmless. Calm and harmless are not the same thing," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, though he heard it anyway. "No," Kale agreed. "They're really not." The recess chime sounded a moment later, its bright, ordinary tone feeling strangely out of place against the weight still hanging in the room. Nobody moved right away. For a long moment, we all simply sat there, processing, recalculating, trying to fit this new understanding into the shape of a boy who, up until an hour ago, had been nothing more than the quiet, friendly new student who occasionally said strange things about gravity and spice tolerance. I don't think any of us left that comms room the same way we entered it. By the time the next class period began, word of what had happened in the comms room had already spread across the entire academy floor. I noticed it the moment I stepped into the dining hall for the midday meal. Conversations quieted as I passed certain tables, then picked up again in hurried whispers the instant I was out of earshot. A pair of second-year students I barely recognized watched Cale from across the room, with expressions somewhere between fascination and open wariness, tracking him, the way you might track a storm cloud that had wandered somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. Cale himself seemed largely unbothered by the attention, which somehow made it stranger. He loaded his tray with the same casual ease as always, exchanged a friendly nod with a passing instructor, and settled into our usual table like nothing at all had changed. Mira and I sat across from him, and for a while nobody spoke, the silence filled only by the clatter of trays and the low murmur of the dining hall around us. "You don't seem worried," Mira finally said, watching him with the same careful curiosity she'd shown since the recording first played. "Everyone in this room is talking about you, and you're eating like it's any other day." "What am I supposed to do, stop eating?" Cale said with a small smile, though I noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes the way it usually did. "I get that today was a lot. Honestly, it was a lot for me too. I didn't expect to end up giving a whole species profile in the middle of a xenobiology lesson." "You handled it well," I said, and I meant it, though the words felt strange coming out of my mouth given how unsettled I still felt underneath them. "Better than I think most of us would have, in your position." "I've had practice," Cale admitted. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened. Every time a group of us goes somewhere new, there's usually a moment where everybody has to recalibrate what they think they know about humans. It's kind of become a pattern by now." Mira's wings shifted slightly, a small, thoughtful movement, rather than the anxious flutter from earlier. "A pattern," she repeated. "That implies this has happened often enough for you to expect it." "Pretty much every first contact situation, yeah," Cale said. "Somebody plays us a recording, or shows us a threat assessment, or asks us to demonstrate something we consider completely normal, and it turns into this whole thing. I think it's because most species build their idea of danger around what they've personally experienced. You see something that sounds terrifying, you assume it has to be terrifying to everyone. It's a pretty reasonable assumption, honestly. It just doesn't always hold up when the thing making the terrifying sound turns out to be somebody's grumpy old house cat." I thought about that for a long moment, turning the idea over in my mind, the way I might examine an unfamiliar equation, looking for the part that didn't balance. "But it isn't only about the house cat," I said slowly. "It's about what it means that a species could grow so accustomed to danger that an apex predator becomes something ordinary enough to keep in a home. That isn't really about the animal at all. It's about what your species has survived to get to that point." Cale's expression sobered, and for a moment the easy, friendly boy I had known for 3 weeks looked considerably older than his years. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's usually the part that actually sticks with people, once the initial shock wears off. It's not really about Ruby. She's just the thing that happened to be sitting there when the conversation started." Across the dining hall, I caught sight of Professor Voss speaking in low, urgent tones with 2 other instructors, none of them glancing our way, though something about the tightness in their postures told me exactly what they were discussing. I wondered how many other conversations like this were happening across the academy at that exact moment. How many instructors were quietly reassessing lesson plans, threat assessments, entire courses built around a galaxy that had just gained a very different understanding of one of its newest members. "Can I ask you something?" Mira said, her voice quieter now, more careful. "Earlier, you said fear that doesn't help you survive is just extra weight. Do you actually believe that? Or is that something your species tells itself, so the fear is easier to carry?" Cale considered the question with a seriousness that surprised me, taking his time before answering. "Honestly, probably both," he admitted. "I think it started as something we told ourselves because we had to. You can't build a whole civilization while flinching at every shadow. But somewhere along the way it stopped being just a story we told ourselves and became something closer to true. Doesn't mean the fear isn't still there, underneath everything. It's just quieter than it used to be. More like background noise than a constant scream." "That sounds exhausting," I said honestly. "It probably is, if you think about it too hard," Cale said with a small, tired laugh. "Most of us just try not to think about it too hard." The recess chime sounded, signaling the end of the midday meal, and the dining hall began emptying in slow, uneven waves. Cale stood, gathering his tray with the same unhurried motions as always, though I noticed his eyes lingered a moment longer than usual on the small clusters of students still watching him from across the room. "For what it's worth," he said, glancing back at Mira and me before we headed toward our next class, "I really am sorry if today scared anyone more than it needed to." "That was never the point." "I don't think you scared us on purpose," I said, and I meant it. "I think you just told us the truth, and the truth turned out to be bigger than any of us expected." Cale nodded slowly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That tends to be how it goes with us." As we walked toward our next lesson, I found myself glancing at the other students filling the corridor, at the careful, measuring looks so many of them now gave Cale as he passed. Looks that hadn't existed that morning, looks that would likely never fully disappear again. The academy had changed sometime during that single class period, though nothing about its walls or its schedule was any different. What had changed was quieter than that, and far more permanent. It was the understanding, settling slowly into every mind that had witnessed it, that the calm, friendly human, who had spent 3 weeks blending unremarkably into academy life, was not calm because he had nothing to fear. He was calm because fear, for his entire species, had become something they had learned to carry so well that most of the galaxy had never noticed they were carrying it at all. By the end of the week, the story had traveled far beyond our classroom. I heard it retold in the training yard by cadets who hadn't even been present for the original lesson, each version slightly different from the last, some exaggerating the size of the creature, others insisting the recording had been faked entirely, unable to accept the simpler and far more unsettling truth. I heard instructors from other departments requesting access to the recording and the call footage, citing academic interest, though the tightness in their voices suggested something closer to genuine concern. Even students who had never spoken to Cale before began finding small excuses to walk past our table during meals, watching him with the same careful, searching curiosity Mira and I had shown that first day. Professor Voss called a special session later that week, not just for our class, but for several senior instructors as well. All of them crowding into a lecture hall meant for a much smaller audience. I sat near the front this time, close enough to see the tension still lingering behind her composed expression. "I have spent the past several days reviewing every threat assessment this academy has on file regarding humanity," she began, addressing the room without any of her usual dry formality. "I want to share what I found, because I believe every student and instructor in this building deserves to understand exactly what shifted this week." She activated the projector, and a long, dense document filled the screen, filled with charts and survey data I recognized from our earlier lessons on emerging species. "This is the current threat classification for humanity, as maintained by the Regional Council," she said. "It was last updated 8 months ago, following humanity's admission to interspecies academic exchange programs. At the time, the classification was listed as unknown, pending further observation, with a provisional threat rating comparable to most newly contacted species." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "I have submitted a formal request to have that classification reviewed." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room, and I felt my own stomach tighten at the implication. "Based on what happened in class," I said, before I could stop myself, "you believe the classification is inaccurate." "I believe," Professor Voss said carefully, "that any classification built around observable aggression, technological capability, or territorial behavior, the standard metrics used for nearly every species this council has ever assessed, fundamentally fails to account for a species whose true nature is not visible on the surface at all. Cadet Brennan did not demonstrate danger to this class. He demonstrated the absence of visible fear in the face of something every other species in this room found genuinely terrifying. And when questioned further, he revealed, calmly, without any apparent understanding of how significant the admission was, that his species has spent its entire history systematically overcoming exactly that kind of threat, again and again, until doing so became so routine it no longer registered as remarkable to them. I glanced toward the back of the lecture hall, where Cale sat quietly, arms crossed, listening to the discussion about his own species with an expression I couldn't quite read. He hadn't said much since the special session began, though I noticed the easy, relaxed posture from earlier in the week had grown noticeably more careful. "That is not a threat rating built for offense," Professor Voss continued. "That is not a species you contain with a warning sign or a boundary line, the way you might a predator, whose danger is a matter of biology and territory. That is a species whose danger, if it exists at all, is a matter of history, patience, and an almost incomprehensible tolerance for hardship most of us cannot begin to relate to." The room had gone very quiet, the kind of silence that comes when a group of intelligent minds are all working through the same unsettling calculation at once. I thought about the recording, about Ruby curled contentedly on a couch, about the low, easy way Kale had described walls built over thousands of years to keep an entire history of danger just far enough away that most humans never had to think about it at all. I thought about the phrase he had used, that the fear hadn't disappeared, it had simply moved. "Professor," Dax said slowly, raising a hand, though he didn't wait to be called on. "If this reclassification proceeds, what happens to Cadet Brennan? What happens to the human exchange program itself?" "That," Professor Voss admitted, "is precisely the question the Regional Council will now have to answer, and I do not believe there is a simple response available to them. This academy accepted a human student under the assumption that his species represented a curious but unremarkable addition to our understanding of the galaxy. What we now understand is considerably more complicated than that." I glanced back toward Kale again, and this time our eyes met across the room. He gave a small, tired smile, not the easy grin from the start of the week, but something quieter, more resigned, the expression of someone who had lived through this exact recalibration in the eyes of strangers, more times than he probably cared to count. After the session ended, I found him waiting near the exit, watching the rest of the class file past him with the same careful, measuring looks that had followed him all week. "You knew this would happen," I said, more statement than question. "Not the specifics, maybe, but you knew. The moment you said that sound was just a pet, that it would end up here eventually." "I had a pretty good guess," Kale admitted. "It always ends up somewhere close to this. Doesn't really matter what triggers it. Sooner or later, whoever we're talking to figures out that the calm isn't the whole story, and then everybody has to decide what to do with that information." "And what do you want them to do with it?" I asked. Kale was quiet for a long moment, watching the last of the students disappear down the corridor before answering. "Honestly, I just want people to understand we're not looking to be anybody's nightmare," he said. "We didn't build all those walls to hide something we're proud of. We built them because we didn't want to be afraid anymore, and it worked, mostly. I know that's a lot to ask people to just take on faith, especially after a week like this one, but it's the truth, whether it makes people feel better or worse about having us around." I didn't have an answer for that. I only knew that whatever careful, comfortable understanding of the galaxy I had walked into that classroom with a week earlier had been permanently altered, replaced by something far more uncertain and far more difficult to look away from. As we walked out of the lecture hall together, I found myself wondering how many other classrooms, on how many other worlds, were having some version of this exact conversation, each of them slowly, quietly, arriving at the same unsettling conclusion, that humanity's calm was not the absence of a nightmare. It was simply a nightmare that had learned, over countless generations, how to smile. The council's decision came 3 weeks later, delivered not as an announcement, but as a quiet update buried in the Academy's administrative bulletin, the kind of notice most students would have scrolled past without a second glance, had the entire school not been waiting for it. Humanity's threat classification had been changed from unknown, pending observation, to a new designation entirely, one the bulletin didn't bother explaining, because no explanation existed yet. There was no existing category for a species whose danger could not be measured by weapons, or territory, or biology, but by something far less visible. A tolerance for hardship built over countless generations, a calm that had been earned through more loss than most of us could imagine, a history of overcoming threats so thoroughly that the overcoming itself had become as ordinary as breathing. I read the notice standing in the same corridor where I had first heard the recording play, and I found myself glancing instinctively toward the classroom door, half expecting to see Kale there, grinning, ready to explain away the whole unsettling notice with some easy comment about his cat. He wasn't there. I found him later that day in the courtyard, sitting alone on a bench, watching the twin suns dip toward the horizon, with an expression far more contemplative than I had ever seen him wear. "You've heard," he said, without looking up as I approached. "Everyone's heard," I said, sitting down beside him. "I think half the academy has already decided what it means, even though I don't think any of them actually know." Kale let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, that tends to happen too. People fill in the blanks with whatever scares them most, because uncertainty is worse than knowing something bad. At least something bad you can plan around." "Is it bad?" I asked. "The classification, I mean. Do you think it's fair?" He considered the question for a long moment, watching the light fade slowly across the courtyard. "I don't know if fair is really the right word for it," he said eventually. "I think it's honest, which is more than most classifications manage. We are what we are. Calm mostly, patient, definitely, and underneath all of that, carrying more than most people ever bother to notice. I don't think that makes us dangerous exactly, but I understand why it makes people careful." "Careful isn't the same as afraid," I said, echoing something he had told me weeks earlier, back when this had all started with nothing more than a recorded growl and a classroom full of startled students. Kale glanced at me, something like gratitude flickering behind his tired eyes. "No," he agreed. "It's really not." We sat together in silence for a while, watching the suns finish their slow descent, and I found myself thinking back over everything that single lesson had unraveled. A predator's call that turned out to belong to a sleepy house cat, a boy who had never meant to reveal anything at all, only to correct a simple misunderstanding about his pet, an entire species whose greatest danger, it seemed, was not what it had become, but everything it had already survived to get there. I thought about Ruby, curled somewhere on a couch light years away, utterly unaware that her sleepy, demanding presence had rippled outward into council chambers and threat assessments, and quiet, careful conversations across an entire academy. She would never know any of it. She would simply keep waiting for her dinner bowl to be filled, exactly as she always had, blissfully unbothered by the storm her existence had quietly set into motion. "Do you think it'll always be like this?" I asked. "Every new species you meet, having to go through some version of what happened in our classroom." Kale thought about it, and for the first time all evening, something like his old, easy grin returned, though softer now, more tired around the edges. "Probably," he admitted. "I think that's just kind of what it means to be us, out here. We're not trying to be anybody's nightmare. We're just trying to live our lives, same as everybody else. But every so often, somebody plays the wrong recording, or asks the wrong question, and we end up having to explain the whole complicated truth all over again." "And is that truth something the rest of us should be afraid of?" I asked quietly, giving voice to the question that had been sitting, unspoken, at the center of every conversation across the academy for weeks. Kale turned to look at me fully then, and for a moment I saw past the easy grin, past the calm, unbothered posture he wore like a second skin, down to something older and steadier underneath it, something that had been carried a very long way to get here. "I think," he said slowly, "that depends less on what we are, and more on what you decide to do with the knowing. We're not planning on giving anybody a reason to be afraid, but I won't pretend the reason isn't there, if it ever came down to it. I'd rather you understood that now, calmly, over a conversation in a courtyard, than find it out some other way, later, when it actually mattered." The suns finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the courtyard bathed in the soft, artificial glow of the academy's evening lights. Somewhere behind us, the building was already settling into its usual nighttime quiet, students drifting back to their quarters, instructors closing their offices, the ordinary rhythm of academy life continuing on, despite everything that had shifted beneath it. But I don't think anything about that rhythm would ever feel quite as simple again. Not for me, and not for anyone else who had sat in that classroom the day a recorded growl turned out to belong to something as gentle as a house pet, and as vast and unknowable as an entire species that had learned, over countless generations, how to survive absolutely anything, and still find a way to smile through it. I thought about the title the recording had once carried in our lesson files, Deadliest Predator in Surveyed Space, and how easily, how casually, Kale had dismissed it with nothing more than a grin and 4 simple words. That's just a pet. I understood now that he hadn't been wrong. Ruby truly was just a pet, gentle, lazy, utterly harmless to anyone who knew her. But I also understood, walking back toward my quarters that evening beneath a sky suddenly full of unfamiliar shapes and unspoken possibilities, that the galaxy had just been given its first real glimpse of something far larger standing quietly behind that grin. And it had only taken a single class period, one recording, and one very tired housecat named Ruby to begin it.